Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 883rd New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and today I have the huge pleasure and privilege of being your MC for a conversation featuring Robyn Farrell, Alison Burstein, and Charlotte Kent. We are thrilled to welcome poet Kai Ihns here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter, and here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but they serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guests and host. Robyn Farrell is the newly appointed Senior Curator at the Kitchen, where she will be responsible for expanding the institution's program as the organization reimagines itself to best serve the next generation of the avant-garde. She has contributed to monographs and international publications on subjects ranging from conceptual art and the moving image to artist networks and emerging disciplines of time-based media. Alison Burstein is a curator at the Kitchen, where she organizes exhibitions, performances, artist residencies, research initiatives, and digital programming. She previously served as program director at Recess and as a member of the education departments at MoMA, the Guggenheim, and the Brooklyn Museum. And our host today, Associate Professor of Visual Culture at Montclair State University, Dr. Charlotte Kent, has a particular interest in historical frameworks for art practices, with a research focus on contemporary digital culture and the absurd. She writes for assorted magazines and various academic journals, and we are so lucky to have her as an editor-at-large here at the Brooklyn Rail. Thank you all so much for being here in conversation today, and I'm excited to pass it over to you, Charlotte.
Thank you, Eleanor, and thank you, Alison and Robyn, for joining. It is such a pleasure to get to have a conversation about the extraordinary work that the Kitchen has done for so many decades now. Recognizing that there are members of the audience who are deeply familiar with the Kitchen and some who are excited to learn more, I was hoping that the two of you would just sort of give us a quick sort of overview of the Kitchen, just some of the sort of same foundational things, and that will help launch the conversation as we move back and forth between history and now and what's to come. Whichever one of you might like to get started.
Thank you, Charlotte. I'm Robyn Farrell. I'm newly joining the Kitchen. This is my third week, so I'm really happy to be here and in conversation with you and Alison. And thank you to everyone at Brooklyn Rail for making this happen. I'm going to give a very brief intro to Alison, who's going to provide a more comprehensive history. But just to say that the Kitchen is one of New York City's oldest nonprofit alternative art centers, dedicated to emerging and established artists and giving opportunities to create and present new work within and across disciplines that include dance, music, theater, visual art, and literature. It operates in a Kunsthalle model and brings all of these forms of performance, exhibition making, and public programming under one roof. And what we do at the Kitchen is empower audiences and communities to creatively think and radically engage in what it means to have a sustainable future in art and to remake art history and catalyze creative change. I will hand it over to Alison, who can provide more details on the history.
Thank you so much, Robyn. And I just want to echo the thanks for everyone who's brought this event together. Charlotte, Eleanor, Chloe, it's really a pleasure to be here and to see everyone here in the audience. So just to, maybe give some historical context for where we came from. The Kitchen was founded in 1971 as an artist collective by two video artists, Dinah and Woody Vasilka, who had been creating work as embedded in a community of video makers in New York City. And as the story goes, they had access to video equipment through Woody's job, working in commercial editing facilities, and they invited artists over to use them in their apartment. And at a certain point, the apartment became too small to fit the activities that they were hoping to offer. And as as it's hard to imagine from today, but at the time the equipment was very hard to access. So being able to provide that access to resources was really valuable to the community and was really the foundation of why they wanted to open up a space where many people could come in and experiment. And what we see here is Steina and Woody, along with two of the other co-directors who came together to form the space. On the left, Dmitry Devyatkin and Reese Chatham on the right. And together, this collective, along with a number of other individuals, including Andres Manek, who located the space, they formed the kitchen at the Mercer Art Center, which was a multi-organization venue in what was then Greenwich Village. And they built out the space to be a live theater where events started to unfold that really, I think, give the seeds for where we are today. And we can move forward in the slides to see some of what happened. So what you see is here, live image processing on a set of screens, the audience watching. The founders, sometimes Steina and Woody, thought of the space as a live audience test laboratory. They were really interested in what would happen when video came into contact with audience in real time. And from early on, there was interest in video makers collaborating with artists working in other disciplines, including music. Reese Chatham was the first music director. And we can advance the slides just to give a little flavor. More performance underway in this space. And then if we move forward again, we can see this is where the kitchen was located in this environment amongst many other organizations, and that they referred to it as a polluted environment. It was not a high art environment. There were spaces that were hosting pop music, there were other theaters, then there was a lot intermingling of audiences across. And then if you move forward, we can see on the calendar the kinds of programs that were central to the kitchen from its founding days. We had a Monday night concert series that Reese Chatham was organizing, open house screenings for video makers, live video performances and other performances. And this is how the space ran from 1971 to 73 at the Mercer Art Center, very much as a collective endeavor. As the founders say, there was no curation or selection. It was only welcoming people who wanted to present. And after the 1973, I'll just flag as an important turning point for our history, in that we, the kitchen started to outgrow that space yet again. The rent was being raised, and they decided to move into their own loft space. And at the time, the Solkos were also moving out of the city to take on teaching jobs. And with that, the leadership passed over to a man named Robert Stearns, who became the first executive director. And in 1973, Stearns located a new space, its own freestanding loft. You can advance the slide, on Wooster Street. And here, in many ways, 1973 marks the second founding of the kitchen. This was when they moved into this space, they incorporated it formally as a nonprofit and adapted the structures that continue into the present day. So rather than going through our full history, I just wanted to flag what I think is a really key aspect of our DNA, that the kitchen was founded as an artist collective and ran very organically over the first 3 years. And then and that 1973 point became more of what has allowed the kitchen to persist into the present day. And I think that's something that we always like to highlight and talk about in cases like this, something that maybe is a little bit lesser known. And then fast forwarding, we can skip just a few more slides to show that in these years, the programming evolved to include many other disciplines. I know this isn't terribly legible, but it shows that these monthly calendar practice persisted as the kitchen promoted its wide range of programming across disciplines that started to evolve organically with the needs of, and interests of artists. So moving from video and music, which were the kind of founding programs, into performance, visual art, and then over the decades, additionally, film, literature, performance. We can talk more about this sort of order of these later on. And then finally, after operating out of that loft for about a decade, in 1985, the kitchen moved once again to its building on 19th Street, which we can see in the next slide. And that is where the organization has been based ever since, up until this year when we began, last year when we began renovation on that project. And over the years, the seeds of what was planted in those those earliest days, following the artist's needs, becoming a community of resource sharing, growing a program to fit different disciplines and work between disciplines. These are all threads that I think run very deeply through our history that we can pick up on as we continue to talk today.
Thank you so much for that. It is actually always a really good reminder because, you know, I mean, for someone like me, you know, I sort of, you know, grew up in Hell's Kitchen, and one of my first memories of the kitchen is my mom, who was a film critic, you know, sort of dressing up and looking super cool, and because she was headed to an event there, and I have no idea what it was. That part of it is not a part of that early memory, but it was just like this sort of thing that was there, and that was where really interesting things happened, where she and her friends in the arts would go check things out. And it, you know, so it's that funny thing where it's like, once you start to be interested in the kitchen and you get involved with it, it's like, it feels very personal. And then it's like, oh, right, it has this legacy and it's this institution, it's gone through all these transformations. And since I do want to talk all about that, but nevertheless, and recognizing, Robyn, that you know, officially you've only been involved with the kitchen for, you know, 3 weeks, but nevertheless, I just wanted to start by asking, what is your first sort of memory of the kitchen, whether it was like the first time you were there or just hearing about it? Because I think it's always so interesting to hear that first encounter.
My first encounter, I imagine, is similar to many who are not based in New York. I'm actually I'm here from Chicago. I'm moving to New York in a week, so in my research is how I first encountered the kitchen and video collectives and knowing the Vasuka's work. And so I became aware of it through research and knowing about its rich legacy. So that was sort of my first entry point. I don't know, maybe even, you know, at some point in graduate school, I believe. And then I probably first visited the kitchen in the late 2000s or the early 2000s. I definitely know Claire Chase was probably one of the first artists that I saw there. And then I've visited so many countless times since then. And I've kind of just had this interesting history with the kitchen, in that even work that I've done at the Art Institute, whether through acquisitions or special projects, have actually been works that may have premiered at the kitchen, like Gretchen Bender's Total Recall, or, you know, other works that we've acquired by Charles Atlas and other artists. So it has been this like really wonderful, organic relationship that I've had. So I'm of course thrilled to actually physically be joining the kitchen very, very soon. And being a part of kind of what the new kind of legacy is going to be with this incredibly momentous moment of transformation with the new building.
It's great to hear, and I can jump in. I mean, I think in many ways my experience resonates very much with what you were describing, Charlotte, that I first started to visit the kitchen shortly after I moved to New York out of undergrad. And I think it was a space that I encountered just part of my explorations, getting to know the New York City arts landscape as a young person wanting to get involved with the field. And I kind of in the inverse relation, that what you described, Robyn, and I didn't know as much about the history. It's not a space that I'd encountered in the small amount of art history that I'd done prior to graduating. And as I started to go, it just came to be a space that I was always excited to visit, to see what I would encounter. I often didn't know the artists or have much background on what I was going to see, but I remember just over that first year I lived here, just going to see as much as I could. And each time sort of leaving with a new understanding of what artists were working on, what different, you know, forms of performance or visual art could look like. And I, over the time, started to fill in the gaps of what I didn't understand about the history as I became more involved and interested in the legacies of the alternative space movement, and then started to put the pieces together and appreciate the incredibly deep and rich history that I've come to spend a lot of time with in my current role.
It's really extraordinary because as a part of sort of preparing for this, I was, doing that thing, you sort of poke around and you try and learn a little bit more than, you thought you knew. And there's always more to learn. And if there's anything that can just make everyone want to go to sleep, it's, mission statements. I mean, they're just often the most full of hot air, et cetera, et cetera. And I was so delighted when I found the kitchen's values and I was reading through them. And if anyone in the audience hasn't read them, I totally encourage you to check out the website. They're, available through the menu bar thing. But they are some of the clearest, most legible, and sound so sincere values. And I wanted to pick up on the second one just because it presents, avant-garde and experimental are never singular. The avant-garde is not an exclusive club. It has many global missions and definitions and belongs to everyone. I think I maybe had just got choked up saying that out loud. And it was just, it's the sort of thing where it's like, it's so difficult to say that kind of thing and not have it sound either like it's art speak or like it's, cobbling together a bunch of things that everyone wants to hear, but then no one actually knows what it means. And the avant-garde, I mean, just even from that brief introduction, Alison, that you were presenting is like so clearly a part of it in the sense of that really just checking things out that are at the edges, at the borders, at the, the very possibilities of where the arts are headed. And so one of the things that I was thinking about with that is like when you have so many avant-gardes, right? And the kitchen has not only been a part of that, but also cultivated it. How does one continue to sort of both encourage the individual sort of projection of a practice or an artist or a collaborative group in the direction that they're going when they're also so much in conversation with others and somehow under this one roof becoming intertwined? Because it seems like that would be at the heart of maintaining both like that it's not an exclusive club and that it also has a sort of connectivity. I don't know, I'm just putting it out there. Like, how has that been, how's that worked? How do you see it happening? Like, what are some of the projects you see where like artists came into relationship and yet maintain their distinctive trajectories?
I can start off with a word or two, and then I'd love to, join in conversation with you, Robyn. But I think one of the points that I think is really fascinating, again, charting back to our history to see how things have evolved. I think the kitchen was one of the first spaces that was dedicated to interdisciplinary experimentation. And as I mentioned, beginning with that, the collaborations between video artists and musicians that were fundamental to those first years. But that was just one form of collaborations that was happening at Mercer Street. There was dance, there was performance, and there was a fluidity between those programs. And I think that distinguishes the kitchen, and I think also defines the form of art avant-garde productions or avant-garde practices that we have supported over the years. So, as you're alluding, Charlotte, there are so many different definitions of the avant-garde, as our values also state. We think of that term expansively, but one of the things that I think we can trace throughout our history is that one of the ways that artists have pushed at the boundaries and experimented is by merging practices in unusual ways or in ways that hadn't been practiced before and hadn't been supported by other institutions. And I think that's something that is also really exciting to think about, is the kinds of practices that were able to flourish at the kitchen that might not have existed otherwise because a gallery context was too rigid, for example, or something. So I think I'm sort of naming this because I think the interdisciplinarity that is so central is also, there are ways that has been played out over the course of our history where the disciplines were named discretely versus blurred together. So actually early on, the programming was divided into discipline categories, and there were curators responsible for each discipline. As I mentioned, Reese Chatham being the first music director. As the space evolved, there was a video director, there was a visual performance director, and this, even still with this delineation, the curators were all speaking to one another, programming things, sometimes informing one another across, there were days when Robert Longo was the video curator and was in close dialogue with Rhys Chatham, and they were sort of sharing, exchanging influences and sort of bringing artists in across the two different disciplines. So I think this is something that sort of to answer your question, that these, if we think about interdisciplinarity as a form of avant-garde, how that hangs together within a space, even as there are different curators working on different areas, I think that's a sort of thread that runs through our history. We've kind of moved back and forth between that specificity. And into the present day, we have, since the early 2000s, all curators work on all disciplines, and all of our programming is much more fluid across these. So I think this is a way that our kind of support of avant-garde practices has evolved over time.
Just adding on to that, in the short time that I have been joining the team virtually here from Chicago, what I've seen immediately and what I've admired for a long time is this idea of collaboration as really a partner in thinking about avant-garde production, and exactly what Alison was just saying, the fact that the disciplines have sort of been blown up many years ago, so that there is no specific category, really allows for this germination of ideas and shared efforts that you see in a lot of the programs that have happened, and currently what's coming up even in this fall season, especially with the Without Walls, since we are programming and partnering with other organizations, DIA to name one, and how that in and of itself is a really sort of radicalizing idea that two institutions can come together and something can be presented not at either of those institutions. And so that's something that I've really have found energizing, and again, sort of rewrites this idea of what something like experimentation or avant-garde can be.
I mean, it's sort of skipping ahead, but I actually just want to, since you just brought it up, I want to talk about that. I mean, I think one of the things that we all know, right, is the arts are struggling. Organizations need support. They, both in terms of audience, support and recognition and celebration, but also just, making things happen in that very straightforward financial way. I think it is this really interesting model of having organizations come together and become collaborative. And we've been seeing more of that, but what you were just describing, Robyn, and what, is sort of being presented as this way of, having two organizations come together and do something, and yet not at either institution, like having it be this sort of both, but truly also its own thing. Is this kind of interesting? There's something very the kitchen about that. But I think, with that in mind, I can immediately imagine so many challenges in doing something like that, right? And I can imagine all the fears that would go into doing something like that would keep an organization from pursuing such an approach. And so I'm just wondering, what do you think have been some touchstones of making that be a successful process? And, what are some of the strengths that either the kitchen has brought or that you have sought out in other organizations to ensure that these types of collaborations go well, so that they become true collaborations and not just in name?
I think it's a great question, and one that we're thinking through and excited to have the space to explore in this period. I think one thing that I've found is that these partnerships have been a nice way to kind of extend or even formalize some of the conversations that we've been engaging in with peer organizations for years, or in different capacities. I think finding opportunities to say, we've been chatting about our shared interests in this way of working, and maybe exchanging advice on the side. Why don't we sit down and think about what that would look like to put on a program together, or to put a structure to this dialogue? And I think one of the things that has been a guiding premise for that is, are there opportunities where we can each bring something and or gain something that we don't currently have in our program? So for example, last fall, we partnered with Madison Square Park on performance project. We were invited to bring an artist in to create a new work in response to the exhibition that was on view by the artist Christina Iglesias, Landscape and Memory. And we invited the artist Bo Bree to create a new performance piece responding to and in dialogue with Christina's work. And in this case, it was an opportunity for the kitchen to take up a form of public art that we had not done in several years, although notably the kitchen had presented a program at Madison Square Park in the early 2000s when that space was, the park was first being sort of changed into what it is now today, or turned into what it is now today, let's say. But in this case, we were able to bring performance outside our walls, literally encounter people on the streets in ways that we had not been able to do. And by the same token, Madison Square Park was able to, through partnering with us, work with the younger artists, work with more emerging artists that they had that they often do in their programming, and also take on a form and a scale of performance that they hadn't had in their programming for several seasons before. So it was a really synergistic opportunity for each of us to come together and bring this project to life, each bringing our own sort of ethos and networks to the fore of the partnership.
Robyn, did you want to add anything? Because I wanted to ask another, but
I don't have anything to add yet, but
you should just jump in whenever you want.
No, I will. I guess the only thing I would say is that in extending beyond the physical boundaries of the kitchen, I think it's important to note this idea of opening, this idea of accessibility and our audiences. And I also just wanted to kind of mention that bleeds into the virtual space as well with our new website. And so I don't want to get off topic, but just sort of with what Alison was saying and thinking about Madison Square Park, it's like this idea of really thinking about what it means to have our community, but then also really extend beyond what that community looks like, and offering and the opportunity. And Alison's done so much of this with opening up the archive through the website, so that there are multiple entry points into the kitchen's history and our current program. And that alone is like a touchstone for these really amazing partnerships that we're doing with so many different collaborators in the public sphere.
You're bringing that up actually is perfect timing, because I was chatting with a friend who couldn't make the conversation today, but she now lives in London and was just really excited. She, from her time in New York, she had loved the kitchen, had always gone there, and had loved going to the space, right? Had loved being in the environment of it, the sense of the other people who were going there. It was very different from her, very delineated job that she maintained. And one of the things she was saying is she was trying to figure out how a place like the kitchen could turn something like virtual spaces, which still for her feel like they don't quite do the thing that in theory everyone keeps hearing virtual spaces can do. And like just wondering, that was such an important element, the way the kitchen creates a sense of community when people show up in the space. In this increasingly sort of demanded social aspect of having virtual things. And it's important for accessibility. It's important for so many reasons, right? But how to do that, really, I keep using the word, but like community building, community gathering thing. And I'm just wondering, you've already sort of spoken to it a little bit, but like how you're trying to make that happen, especially while you're not in your home space, as it were.
Yeah, I think it's something that it is a question we've been taking up, like many institutions, in the, like all institutions, that is in the earliest days of the pandemic, we had to jump to the digital very quickly. And I think at that time, it was for us a prompt to focus on a space that hadn't been central to the kitchen's efforts to that point. As you're saying, I think that the focus on the live encounters and the exchanges that happen in and around the events that we hosted in 19th Street, are what many people associated with the space. And it was, even though there were features of our website, I think prior to that point, we did not have a large audience for, going to our websites to engage with content for its own purposes. And when we started the programming in the pandemic, it was an opportunity for us to think, okay, what can we translate here, and then experiment in that period out of necessity with bringing different aspects to the fore. And I think that really informed the process of creating the new website. So I think some of the things that we have integrated that have become central to the website, for example, the landing page where there is a recording of a recent performance. You land and with the kitchen is on air, that's the section as it is called. That kind of gives the sense of arriving into an event in the way that you might when you arrive into the lobby of the kitchen for a performance or make your way up to the gallery. And at the same time, it also activates the sense of the depth of our history that, sometimes you open it and it's a recording that happened a week ago, and sometimes it's a recording from 1974, and you can kind of shift through. So that was one of the things that I think was the hope, is to kind of invite people into both the immediacy of the experience and also the breadth of the materials that you'll find as you go in. And I think that is one of the ways that I think the virtual space can kind of allude toward, multiple connections and this kinds of engagements that you would have in a room speaking with friends. It's like through that exploration process, if you're, kind of making, charting your own way and saying, oh, that reminds me of this show that I saw 10 years ago, what's that artist up to now? And then maybe you can chart and find other references. So that's one of the kind of discovery process that I could be an analog to conversations and exchanges that happen in real time.
Thinking about that and thinking about really the sort of extraordinary archive of material that's come out of there. And I both want you to show us a bunch of stuff because I'm so sort of excited about it, but also as this archive gets sort of forefronted and sort of, gets being, especially right now, it's this interesting thing where archives can often feel historical for obvious reasons, right? And so therefore sort of past looking. There's this way sometimes in which we associate archives with a kind of, I get blanking on the word, but over enthusiasm for the past, right? A kind of going into the archive almost as a kind of escape of the present. And so it seems almost as if the sort of interest in the archive and some of the, sort of archival type practices that you've been cultivating with some of the, current projects would almost be in conflict with the avant-garde, right? And so I'm wondering how you at the kitchen have been having conversations around not having archives become these sort of fuddy-duddy, quasi, retrogressive nostalgic spaces, but actually become opportunities to push something further.
I'll just jump in to say a few words and I'll let Alison follow up. But, from my experience of visiting the kitchen and working on projects that have, maybe emerged from time at the kitchen, it's very clear that the program is always really driven by artists. And I think that that's really the key, is letting them lead and supporting them with their vision. And I think I think artists are very interested in history and contemporary simultaneously. And so it's not even a matter of presenting, here's our archive, what does something inspire you? It's sort of that's already part of the conversation. And because the kitchen is this space where so much is happening simultaneously, it itself acts as a living archive, or an active space where artists can call back upon previous work that they've already shown. I mean, we already mentioned like Charles Atlas has had many occasions where he's shown at the Kitchen from the early 70s to, more recently in 2018. And so it's sort of for an artist to have this long form relationship with the space itself is really something to note. And I will kind of turn it over to Alison, who's been doing a lot of really important and exciting projects that are looping in the archive in other ways. But I just wanted to say that it's really the support of artists and knowledge sharing what is happening in the perspective of the Kitchen as an archive in itself is something I think is a important note.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that, Robyn. And I think exactly what you just said, building in that vein, I think one of the things that I find really interesting is, while the associations of the avant-garde and experimental arts is, the new, it is difficult to reach the new without knowing where one is coming from. So I think many of these artists who are innovating and pushing things forward are deeply, have deep knowledge of the past practices. And many of the artists that come to work at the Kitchen, as you're saying, Robyn, are very drawn to the histories of artists and the practices that have unfolded there in the past. So it's often, a first starting point for conversation is, as an artist is coming into work at the Kitchen is, oh, I saw this artist who I've admired and been, that performance influenced me 10 years ago. So I think that there's a natural conversation across generations and across different artists and ways of working that happen in the space of the Kitchen. And then I think for us as an institution, history has a sort of different register, but one thing that I find really fascinating is that from a very early period in the Kitchen's history, as early as the 74, 75 period under Robert Stern's directorship, there was a self-reflexivity around the importance of what was happening and an awareness that the activities that were going on there were important to the field and would be meaningful to be seen into the future. So because it was a space that had access to video and recording resources, the team was documenting performances from the earliest days at the Mercer Art Center and building out this collection that by the early 1970s, they were presenting to audiences as an archive. And there was a space in the loft in Wooster Street by around 1975 called the Video Viewing Room that opened, and there was an invitation for our audience members to come in and request a video from the collection. So to watch a video of a recording that had taken place, to watch a recording of a performance that had taken place the year before. So this awareness from early on that I don't want to go so far as to say that history was in the making, but they knew that something important was happening and that there was an impetus to share those resources. I think that sort of is part of what we have carried forward, the sense that the institution's history is a resource for the wider field and thinking about different ways to make that available. And that's something that we've tapped into through recent programming. One of the programs that we're really excited to be pursuing these in the past 2 years is a research residency, the lab research residency centered on our archive. And that's an opportunity to really invite artists to do the work that, as I say, many people take up voluntarily when they come to work at the Kitchen is they want to look into the history. But this research residency is an invitation to look at the archive as material and inspiration for the creation of new work. It is currently, we're in a year-long cycle in partnership with the School for Poetic Computation and through the support of the Simons Foundation with 4 primary researchers who have taken up research projects combing through materials that include recordings, oral histories, print ephemera, posters, and through these encounters, they've posed questions and started conversations that have led to a series of programs that are going to be unfolding over the next month. So that's one of the program formats that we've used to activate our history, not as a way of looking back, but as a way to inspire new production in the present.
I'm wondering if I can, just sort of to push on some of these ideas, because it's interesting to remember, of course, that in the 70s, as in those early days, there wasn't a lot of access to some of these technologies, right? That's why it was so important that there was this shared resource, and like that is remains true, in fact, to this day, right? Like the way in which artists can have tools and devices and materials that are too much for everyone to have, and that there needs to be a sharing. But at the same time, that there was increasingly these products on the market that made it possible for, artists to be recording. It's the era of video art and so forth, right? And the way in which it's both this moment of like recording because history is being made, but also recording to make history, right? Like that there's this kind of dual thing that's happening in that moment. And I've sort of interested in that because I at the same time, there's this thing that's happening around like sort of performance and certain types of experimental sound and dance and, different types of performance contexts that is very, very much about the fleeting moment, right? And that the presence of being there is what it is. And if you are not there, then you haven't been there. And that's okay. That's just like, that was part of the thing, was to have been there. And especially as, now some decades later, right, we find ourselves like, I mean, I don't know, maybe there's someone, here with us today who doesn't have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photos that they will not look at on the device that they carry with them everywhere. But if that person is here, you are an amazing human being. I am not that person. And I don't know anyone who's that person, right? We have become this kind of like weirdly hoarding, obsessively recording, as if to like prove some history, like you need to be able to show the thing that you saw a week to someone, maybe someday, who knows, like it's unclear. And so I'm wondering, the flip side of the archive is the way in which it loses that sense of be here, like, I can't believe I just said it, but like be here now, right? And that the importance of showing up because this is the only chance to show up, right? Like, and that's actually a valuable thing to also cultivate. And so I'm just wondering, like, as, with the different artists coming in, the different collaborative groups and the different modalities that you're seeing, like, what are you seeing and hearing from the artists around that, not conflict, but dichotomy? And this is an open question, Robyn. If you don't want to speak to just what's happening at the kitchen, it's really more of an open question just because I think it's an applicable question in the arts overall.
I mean, that's what I was going to say is this. I think this is something that confronts all, artists and creatives and institutions, and especially with coming off the years of the pandemic where recording was actually so essential insofar as, being able to see something or feel like you're a part of something when you were really isolated. So I think that there's sort of, it's a wrestling between what is important to capture and what is really important to feel in the moment. And from my perspective, with what the kitchen's been doing, and especially with the website, which we already mentioned, is that it does give you a sense of this with the recordings. And as Alison said, when you get to the landing page and you immediately see something that's previously happened, I think that it does denote something that happened in history. And I think that then it stands alone from what might be experienced in the round, in the real. And I feel that, of course, since I'm joining at this moment, but with this Without Walls programming and having these different moments where people can encounter the kitchen's program outside of the space itself, really is an opportunity to, I think explore that slippage, because it's even if something's recorded at a gas station, for example, it's going to look different than a program that happened at the kitchen, and folks that have visited the kitchen for years will find themselves, I think, just physically reacting differently because they'll be in a different environment. So I think sort of disrupting the even tradition, the space that we're all, used to of the kitchen is really actually a way to displace that, and might actually have this, Brechtian way of awaking everyone from some sort of passive experience of viewing and becoming more engaged, which might be sort of this happy parallel that's coming out of the fact that we're working outside of our normal space.
I wonder, Alison, if I might get you now to show us some of the Gretchen Bender works, because I feel like in certain ways, one of the many reasons I adore her is just because she did that. Like she was so aware of something around how mediation was doing something, and how could we engage with media while staying cognizant of the fact that it was a mediation, right? So if you just want to jump in.
Yeah, well, I think I'll pass it over to Robyn. I just think just sort of on the side note that I will mention before talking about this more in depth. I mean, I think Gretchen Bender is a really exciting example of an artist who has a long, who this work premiered at the Kitchen in 1987. And then what we're seeing here is an installation view of a representation of the work in 2013. And I think, as you're alluding, Charlotte, like Bender's work is, only increasingly relevant as time goes on and as the media landscape shifts. So to be able to revisit a work that had been originally presented at the space, 2.5 decades later, brings out the opportunity to reflect on how the landscape has shifted around it. And then after its presentation at the Kitchen, this work has gone on to take on many other lives. And I don't know if you want to speak more about that, and also some of the significance too, Robyn.
Sure. I'm so happy you brought up Bender, because this is one example of, this is a work, Total Recall, that we see here. This is the 2013 presentation at the Kitchen. The Art Institute of Chicago actually acquired this work. The Society for Contemporary Art acquired this work and then gifted it to the Art Institute of Chicago. And I had the privilege of working on the team that not only brought in the acquisition, but we actually installed this work in Chicago. So we did a lot of work with the Kitchen and looking in their archives and working with the estate, and really looking back to Bender's words and what she said herself about this work, which was really kind of to blast imagery, to really kind of just, really upset the idea of passive entertainment, and put forth the criticality. I mean, she uses media like kind of cannibalizing itself, like to sort of this like flow, this river of imagery is what she wanted to overwhelm people with, to show the overbearing power and control that media had. And she did this through splicing together and editing, collection of clips from films and commercials, CGI animation, well-known like logos like GE, and put that together across 24 different monitors and 3 projection screens. And all this is to say, she was an artist that really kind of had this vision of understanding, not only was looking so adeptly at what was happening currently at the time, which was the late 80s when this work was made, but had a way of foreseeing what our future was going to look like. And Gretchen Bender passed away, I think, in the early 2000s. So unfortunately, we can't speak to her about what maybe how this might compare to what she thought would happen, but it is a marker of what was to come, and again speaks to the Kitchen's rich history of really opening up a space to an artist to present what she called an electronic theater. And it was this, digital operetta, essentially, where it had these theatrical showings throughout a day and over a period of time, and really was meant to have this beginning and end and have a very performative aspect to it. So I will kind of pass it back to you, Charlotte.
I was going to jump in.
I know you wanted to kind of, I know that.
I just wanted to say, I think the idea of the theater thing is really important. One of the things that's interesting about her work, right, is we, so often when we talk about theater, it's like, we have in mind at least the movement on stage, right? But actually, one of the things that has made theater powerful cross-culturally around the world for thousands of years is the intense affective dimension of being in space with other people and experiencing something. And like one of the things great theater somehow accomplishes, right, is the production of, you know, and I'm going to use the word affect or emotion, depending on where you're coming from in these different like disciplinary areas, right? And that, you know, she was cultivating that through and trying to raise awareness of that, as opposed to it being this kind of numbing, as, you know, the sort of passive thing you were talking about, Robyn. But also the reason I want, you know, to sort of bring it back more directly to some of the things around the kitchen is, you know, I think one of the challenges around the conversation of an avant-garde is the way it can feel for people who don't feel like they're a part of that group, that gets alienating. Like, it's too cool for school. I don't know what's going on. I don't get it. I don't, you know, and so one of the things about Gretchen's work that I thought was really interesting, you know, and when I experienced it, was just the way it became like, oh, it's an experience. Like, I just am feeling something, right? Like, it's just, I don't need to know necessarily what's going on or what the imagery is or where it's coming from or some of that type of stuff. Like, I could just like, it's theater in the sense of just that I'm there. I'm going to have something happen in a way that I think can be easily forgotten because of the way in which, like, you know, guilty as charged scholar sometimes writes about these types of things. It's like, isn't this intelligent? And aren't we so scholarly and knowledgeable about the cool things that they were thinking about, right? And forget that kind of other side of it. And that it's important, especially with, you know, interdisciplinarity can sometimes feeling lost, right? Like, it's not in this camp, it's not in that camp. And so, oh, it must be its own camp of, you know, and like, who can participate and what do I have to know? And like, right, it can be challenging. And so just to finally bring it back to a question, apologies for my rambling, but, you know, what are some of the ways that with, especially, you know, just looking at the programming that's, you know, been happening, that's coming up in, you know, the next year, that the kitchen provides a means of space for people to be able to touch in on their own terms and not feel like, you know, they better have made sure they took the cool course on the avant-garde before they show up so that they can get what's going on. You know what I mean?
Yes, I mean, thank you. I think it is such an important question because the term avant-garde is so loaded with associations. You know, there are the many uses, and in many ways, you know, there are many uses that kind of stand in for describing what is undescribable, new practices that kind of fit outside of boundaries. That's one way of thinking about it. But then there, of course, there are the historical associations with the avant-garde, and I think one of the ways that we are trying to create space, you know, maybe not in the experiential, but in the sort of critical realms, is by opening up and kind of questioning the terms and the histories associated with the avant-garde. And that's coming through artists who are interested in taking up these questions. Like, for example, one of the artists in this lab residency that I mentioned right now, Asha Tamarisa, is currently working on a project called Counter-Archiving the Avant-Garde, where she's interested in kind of asking questions about the idea that the avant-garde is, specifically in the sonic arts, that avant-garde artists who were presenting work at the Kitchen in the early 70s were kind of working from a blank slate and taking up new music methodologies, and what happens in using those terminologies and writing over the influences of the global souths that artists were drawing from. And the project that Asha is developing will be a web archive that creates space for relational and polyvocal exchange, sort of expanding histories, offering up this idea of the counter archive as a process of like counteracting, rewriting, revisiting, and revising the knowledges that sort of seem to be sedimented within the space of an archive. So I think that's one way of really just opening up the space to question exactly what you're posing to us, Charlotte, is by, you know, working with artists to kind of think through and kind of deconstruct some of these terms in projects. But then I think there are also a number of other examples of artists who like Matthew Letskanoy, who will be presenting a work this fall called The Filling Station, who are directly referencing moments of historical productions and sort of revisiting and offering a contemporary lens. So that's another way of sort of pulling from history, pulling from lineages of the avant-garde, but opening them up into the present to be experienced and felt anew through today's lens. And I don't know if you have any other thoughts on this question, because it's a huge one, central to the history that you know, we have. The kitchen is both has contributed to shaping the avant-garde, the discourse of the avant-garde in New York and abroad, but also has, I think, at different points and continuously into the present, kind of questioned what this term means and what that association brings.
I mean, I guess one thing, you know, I was, as you were thinking about it, by the way, I'm just going to say, I'm really excited for the filling station. I was looking into that. I think it's going to be, so for those of you in the audience, just it's on the website, you can learn lots about it, but it's, reimagining is the wrong word, so you should correct me, Alison, but like a reinterpretation of a 1938 ballet that is often considered like one of the first homegrown United States of America, choreography, music, the whole shebang. What does it mean to sort of reinterpret that and reimagine that, you know, nearly a century later? And so it will be, I think it's an interesting moment, a moment to think about that moment, and a moment to think about like, how do we begin to think now about ourselves in this. Anyway, we won't get into too many of the politics right there, but I guess one of the things I just wanted to that somehow came to mind as you were speaking, Alison, is just that at the same time, and again, these are like these weird sort of things you hear and like somehow stick in your head. Like, I also think of the kitchen as being the type of place where people would go to and walk away and be like, I have no idea what just happened to me. Like, I don't know what that was. Like, I don't know if that was sound or music or theater or performance or like, what was that? Don't know. And yet it sticks, right? And like, and I'm wondering if, you know, it's difficult because we live in really difficult times. And so I'm not alone sometimes, and just wanting, like, I want something nice. Like, I really do like going and looking sometimes at sitting on a bench and just staring at like a pastoral impressionist painting and just being like, oh, taking it down a notch. And at the same time, there's a need, right, given the times that we're in, also to be disrupted and not to become pacific. How are you all balancing that, right? Like, recognizing that there's a need for both, and that, of course, you have an obligation to the artists, but also there is, if not an obligation, like a recognition of the audiences and where they're at.
I'll just quickly add, in reference to what's germane to the topic is talking about filling station, is that there will actually also be an exhibition on view at our Westbeth space. So therein lies kind of another overlap of disciplines and ways of looking at one particular reimagining of this ballet or of this artist practice, which expands into a new series of paintings and archival materials, audiovisual elements, as well as ephemera. So those will all be on view at our space. So it's not just a performance, it's also kind of a way to interact and to have space to think and maybe kind of dig deeper and to kind of think about the performance. If you see it, if you can't make the performance, you have another way to kind of, you know, get into the work in another way. So I know Alison has more concrete things to speak about with the wonderful work she's doing, but I just wanted to kind of, I guess, plug that. And also, that's one way that I think the kitchen is actively, you know, we have the virtual space online and what's available there. And then we also have, even though we're not, you know, on 19th Street at Westbeth, we do have the opportunity to have visuals on view, in sometimes in collaboration with, or, you know, different than performances that are happening in the calendar as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful way to put it, that the kitchen, one of the benefits of this interdisciplinarity and the range that we have is that we can offer multiple access points in to the work, any given work, or to sort of across the season by kind of rounding out different ideas. And one of the things that I think we've been thinking a lot more about in recent years, in different ways about, I should say, is the questions around interpretation and mediation. So what kinds of materials are we offering when an audience member walks into the space? If it's a printed text, is it an audio description that we're offering on Bloomberg Connects, which is a new platform we've started using? Is it materials that we're offering on the website, an interview with the artist, those sorts of resources that can kind of dimensionalize an engagement with a work, even if the live encounter is one that is maybe a bit perplexing, that there are some other resources that you can turn to find kind of inroads. And I think those questions around the framing and contextualizing are ones that we're really interested in and excited to be exploring through different modes today as well.
So I have realized that I somehow ran out of time to ask all my questions because I got so enthusiastic about some of the strands that we went down. But I'm not worried about it because there's still an opportunity for the audience to ask lots of questions. And I see that in the chat, there's already been some popping up. So I will at this stage say, Alison and Robyn, thank you so much for joining me in my love and curiosity of the work that's happening at the kitchen. And then I'm going to pass it back over to Eleanor so that she can help have the audience get an opportunity to ask all of theirs. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so much, Charlotte.
Thank you so much, Alison. Thank you so much, Robyn. This has been an incredible conversation. And yeah, I agree. I could listen to so much more. But we do have some great questions from the audience. And our first question is from our friend GE. GE, you should be able to unmute.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, Rail, and thank you, panel. And thank you, Kitchen. It's been a part of our culture for so long in so many ways, and the next 50 years. My question is kind of based on that is, how do you keep the kitchen from coming across as excessively institutional? I mean, what's the secret sauce? How does that work?
I love this question. Thank you. I like to reference one, again, an early moment. To me, looking back to our history is so inspiring and informs so much of what we do today. And interestingly, this very question came up as early as 1975. The introductory essay to one of the yearbooks that summarized the activities from that year says, "The kitchen is, gasp, an institution." So this idea that we've been walking this line for 50 years, that even I think it just speaks to the importance of the work that the kitchen was doing, that its efforts were being sort of in dialogue with the broader landscape, that larger institutions were taking up some of the ways that the kitchen had been, or some of the art forms that the kitchen was supporting. All of that, there's a way of thinking about this as a co-optation of the alternative into the mainstream, but I like to think of it as actually a fluid, it's a dialogue back and forth. So as the sort of landscape shifts to adapt more of the alternative, what can the alternative do to kind of take on a slightly new dimension or to kind of push things forward? So I think that's a way of saying that we've just continued to walk that line, that with I think it's a continual process of reflexivity and also assessing what's going on in the field to understand what can we offer that is not already being accounted for. That was the founding ethos of the founders, the Vasulkas and their peers coming together to say, we don't have a place to do this in the institutional landscape, we're going to make one. So for us today, that's saying, what can we offer that other spaces aren't offering, even as more and more, large scale museums, other galleries are embracing the disciplines that had been, not easily integratable just 30 years ago.
I'll just add that there's a nimbleness that the kitchen offers that gives this ability for both the staff that's working inside the organization, as well as to sort of support artists. So I think sort of, to be centered around artists and driven by their vision, but also to have this nimbleness so that the those that are working within the space can enact and catalyze change in a way that feels really urgent and important, I think is really key to not only kind of this pioneering history, but sort of expanding upon that for this, the contemporary landscape as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much, GE. That was a great question. And thanks for those answers. I think we have a great follow-up to this question from Martha Wilson. And Martha, if you'd like to unmute, you should be able to if you want to ask directly.
This has been a wonderful discussion, but there has been no mention of the fact that the video archives of the kitchen, as I understand it, were acquired by the Getty. So I'm curious to know what is your relationship and how do you promote research in the archives if they are physically located in California?
Thank you for that question, Martha. It's good to see you. That is correct, and in fact, it is the whole 20th Century Archive, so including the video recordings, paper materials, posters, etc. What is perhaps lesser known is that that acquisition took place in around 2014, and we maintain a relationship with the Getty to think about ways to make materials accessible. That we have to audiences that are visiting physically, and also artists that we're working with who might not be able to visit California. But at the same time, the kitchen has maintains its own institutional collection as well. So that includes many of the same materials that are at the Getty. We retained copies of, and then we also maintain materials dating to the present, and also a whole collection of materials that are not at the Getty that include like institutional records, development files, these types of materials. And we are currently in the process, we have a full-time archivist working with us, Alex Waterman, who is in the process of organizing and processing the kitchen's collection as an entity that we will be making more and more accessible in the coming years. There's a very ambitious effort underway to work on that, and as this is going on, we've started, through various program threads like the lab residency I mentioned, but also a series of conversations that Alex has spearheaded with our curatorial assistant Angelique Rosales Salgado, called Sobremesa, that's taking place on Montez Press Radio. This is kind of bringing to the fore questions around what it means to be an archive of performance art. This question that you raised, Charlotte, earlier. But so that's to say that as we are in the process of doing the work that will allow us to make the archive accessible to as many people as possible, we're also, starting conversations and interested in speaking as much as we can about the process as it is underway.
Did the kitchen promise to reformat the open reel and cassette tapes into digital form so they could be seen online?
We have hopes of digitizing as much as possible. I think
it's expensive.
It's expensive, and it's an ongoing process. So
yes.
That is one of the things through our, we have, as I mentioned, a close relationship with the Getty, and they're an amazing resource for digitization. So all of the materials that are at the Getty, many of them have been digitized. There's a collection online of videos that can be accessed digitally. And then there is a system that is actually open to the public. I always like to mention this, through a research request form by the Getty to digitize any material that you see in the finding aid of the kitchen's collection. You can put in a request to have it digitized through the Getty. So that is an amazing resource. For our part, we are working to make as many of the digitized materials accessible through our website and through other forms as well, so that they are kind of more easily accessible outside of the sort of systems of finding aids and library catalogs.
Thank you so much, Martha. Thanks, Allison. That was a great response. We have another question from Geppetto in the audience. You should be able to unmute.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah, no, this is really interesting because I first learned about the kitchen back in, I'll say 1990, with the release of their CD, Imaginary Landscapes, New Electronic Music, which exposed me to Shelley Hirsch, David Tudor, Christian Marclay, Alvin Lucier, like all those kind of downtown performance legends. Now, since then, the media art landscape and kind of alternative theater, underground performance scene has changed a lot, and it's changed even a lot, even in the last 10 years, 5 years, however you want to look at it. So my question is, what do you think the New York art scene is like today for multimedia, video, underground theater, performance artists, etc., who are trying to find support and audiences in a very commercialized gallery and fair landscape, which overly privileges painting, especially like right now, where it almost seems like there's a kind of anti-tech backlash going on. Hi, Kitty. I'll just leave that question there. There's a second part, but it's kind of off in the weeds, because digital art culture is not, I understand digital art culture specifically isn't the purview of the kitchen, but in terms of, just this kind of cross-pollinated, cross-practice approach, do you think that, like, what do you think the landscape is these days, and where does the kitchen sit in relationship to it?
Alison, I'm gonna tip this to you more so just because my perspective is from visiting New York, which I feels a little different than when I'll live there. But I've enjoyed hearing so many examples of folks saying they just happened to go to the kitchen and they discovered something new. And my experience of coming to New York has always been this like well-researched reasoning of seeking out what is on view. And so I have always sought out the more media-based exhibitions when they're on view, whether it be sort of major institutions or something at Artist Space, which I would say is an equal partner in shaping a relevant history and presenting pioneering work that delves into the media space. So I am going to tip this over to Alison, and I look forward to exploring it and experiencing it firsthand very, very soon.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested to think about this question even in a on a national level. I see in this comment that you mentioned that Geppetto, that Europe seems to be ahead of the curve in this regard. I think it is an interesting question to think about, globally, what different contexts allow for. But I think, as Robyn alluded, I think in New York we do have the privilege, really, of having a landscape that includes very long-standing institutions like the Kitchen, like Franklin Furnace, like Artist Space that you mentioned, Robyn, that continue to do this work of operating outside of the established, let's say, commercialized models, as you're referring to. And at the same time, it is a space, within New York, there's always new spaces that are being formed. And I think those, some of which are short-lived, that is the reality. But I think that's something, even in the past 10 years, we've seen the emergence of any number of small artist-run or artist-centered organizations that are able to do really amazing work to support artists experimenting in different ways. And I think that kind of like exchange in the ecosystem between the newer generations and the older generations is really valuable.
Amazing. Thank you. That was an amazing question, Geppetto. That was great. All these questions have been so good. I'm so grateful for all of them from the audience, and again to Alison and Robyn and Charlotte. Before we turn it over to Kai for poetry reading, I would love to ask you both a question about the Kitchen. I am curious about how the Kitchen's role in the art scene of New York and more broadly has changed since its inception in the 70s. And I'm thinking specifically about the kitchen's relationship to various activist movements that have been super present in especially New York culture and consciousness over the various periods of time, because I think the kitchen is often very closely involved with and supporting of those movements. So I'd love to hear more about that.
I'll say that, today, I think I said at the outset of this introduction is sort of this like reaffirming of the history, but really doing it through an ambitious mission to prioritize people, both the audiences, the workers, and the artists that all, come together within the physical and virtual space of the kitchen. And I think in prioritizing people and really community is something that is a touchstone for the organization. And that is what continues to foster the community that surrounds us, and also the work that's produced as the result of pushing boundaries and strengthening dialogues between both the national and international, quote unquote, visual or, extended art world. And I think that ambition extends to how we are revisioning the space itself, and that is centered with what's the renovation that's undergoing on 19th Street, and how with our values that we also kind of touched on here is that nothing is really singular. So I think kind of the fluidity of the program and the nimbleness of the space, and really expanding to a global mission, whether that's with performances that are happening in New York or something that is part of an online program, is a way that the kitchen is sort of moving forward and really shaping change for the future.
Go ahead, Alison.
I think Robyn just touched on so much, so I think it's a really nice place to wrap up that question at least.
Agreed. Thank you so much, Robyn. Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Charlotte. This has been such an absolute joy. Now we have a tradition here at the Rail of concluding our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm so excited to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Kai Ihns, to the stage. Kai Ihns recently finished her PhD at UChicago, where she studied a form of attentional prosody she calls aspect choreography in contemporary experimental poetry and film. She makes short films and is the author of one full-length poetry collection called Sunday and a number of pamphlets. Thank you so much, Kai. So excited to hear your reading.
Thanks, Eleanor, and thank you, Alison, Robyn, and Charlotte. That was I don't know, like really actually inspiring. I knew the kitchen was cool, but I didn't know all that. So I'm going to read 6 poems. Yeah, they're all pretty new. Yeah, the first one is called The Birds. I have a vital fear of birds. When they are on the beach, I am disturbed from the beach. When the birds are on the beach, I head for my car. Should the birds extend to the car, I am desperate. The birds can cut me off from exit concisely by being simply in the route. The problem with birds is that there are a lot of birds. You cannot address all the birds that there are. Okay. So this next poem is a kind of riddle. I've been interested in the form of the riddle. It's the first poem in a new manuscript called Of. Okay, poem's called Hickory. You appear to me through the episode in which you are appearing as its shape. When I am seeing it, the tree has 2 faces. The last one is contact. What is that of? Okay. This next one's a very short poem called By Love, I Mean What You Mean Now. There is a scrap in the sky. It itches when I itch it. So we are in love. A woman skates a lane on the frozen lake. Some of the fish are dead, and some are not. Okay. This next poem is called Rester. It includes a quote from Sharon Olds, but I'll mark it when it happens. Rester. Come blasting out into Ohio. Tenderly attach her head to the water filter. Hello, beautiful Rester. I've been thinking on you again, like a fatality. No one's heart is quite like yours. Who can be the Rester? Can you be the Rester and rest there, putting the tool ceaselessly over the face of your children? Give me the tenderness that comes like a shock, not like a moral. It's hard to tell you what's important. How do you live who are not reached easily? Resting. How do you live in the warm crease? Resting. Dust mote day hair, the floor speeding up. The floor is speeding up. That's Sharon Olds. Sharon Olds is a great runner, theater, for real, total and brutal. Duck your pretty head down now, love, and fear. Rester your own personal variations like an excellent wax. Some things have beginnings. Some things are bolted to the clouds now. Some things are a hot sleeper. Truly, who can suck like a conduit can? I, a howling device. At the disaffected Python disco benched on the huggy stud in the Corbach's quiet kit. To be a gentle, intolerable man, I become one. To leave all finding at the sills of Home Depot, at the normal hill. I'll not say the thing about old starlight again, but it goes in my eyes and dies there. Okay, the last two poems. This one's called The Waffle Bathers. Do not abolish remoteness. Make a funny voice to deal with the quiet of a vast, loose, and heavenly net, trying to live like the heavenly net. If this is what it is, then I'll die for it. Perhaps we've the same perforations. The infinite net of truthful or contradictory news, like the dew takes place without location, terribly dries. You can't even tell me when to stop. You can't stop swarming and beeping. Okay, last poem. This is called Spring Poem, or fantasy is precisely what reality can be confused with. That last bit's a quote from Stanley Cavell. Okay, Spring Poem. The harmful nitwits of Godard, host, guest, and me, categories whose practice is being born a snowdrop all the time. Fresh it breathes the face of April, June its ramifying aspect, mineral and incipient tooth has January, the daffodil too about to have a mind. The brush following its emergence of the brush in reality, it resonated all the way here by a possible means, the long wire means of possible means, the goal of the winter mind of heaven and earth, still melon, still loud enough, but a mind with a point. Screaming at birds, enjoy, lying down, the way a certain stick in the heart responds to fairness. Fish food coming down to the angels. Going up? Okay, thank you.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Kai. That was such a lovely reading. It felt like a really perfect way to wrap up and, extend the conversation today. So thank you so much. And just once again, of course, thank you to Robyn and Alison and Charlotte for this amazing dialogue. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel and where this conversation will be posted shortly. For the past 22 years, the Rail has been a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. Check the chat for a link to support all the work we do here at the Rail, and join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Doris Salcedo and Francesca Pietropaolo on the event of Salcedo's solo exhibition at Fundación Bailar. We will conclude with a reading by Susanna Plotz Pineda. Thank you all for tuning in today, and you can now all turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as we head out into the rest of our days.
Thank you.
all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
everyone.
Thanks,
Great
everyone.
discussion.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Kai.
everybody.
Great reading.
Awesome.
Thanks,
you.
Robin.
Thanks, Allison.
Thanks,
Thanks, Charlotte.
everybody.
Thanks. Have a great day,
Thank you,
everybody.
Charlotte.
Really, really great reading, Kai.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you so much. Have a lovely rest of your Thursday.